Welcome to Sleepy Jean. I've got a new book today called The Orphans by Fiona McIntosh. Chapter 1. Fiona, South Australia, April 1914. Something about this moment felt unnerving to Tom Catchlove. It was as though the world around him was physically quieting down in readiness. Tom couldn't pinpoint why. He glanced again through the binoculars around his neck, but saw nothing out of the ordinary. He could sense a strange, almost sinister friction across the desert landscape this morning, and it was making his skin crawl. 6 feet up on one of the twisted limbs of an ancient coolabah tree on the edge of the waterhole, 10-year-old Tom sat, legs swinging as he chewed on some ruby-coloured saltbush berries. They were like gleaming jewels in the parched wilderness, and the citrusy explosion on his tongue as each tiny berry popped made his mouth water and eyes squint. He was being careful not to spill the scarlet juice on his shirt. He didn't want to create more work for his mother. He batted away the annoying, stickly-footed flies that always tried to get into his eyes and looked up through the tree into the depthless vault of the sky. His upside-down sea, the colour lightened towards the horizon, but directly above it was such a brilliant Egyptian blue that he could pick out each gum leaf with precision. Against it, his mother, Moira, had told him that while nature had created this many hues of the sky, the ancient Egyptians had reproduced this particular one for their art by mixing limestone with azurite. Azurite contains copper that heated Tom and turned it into glass that would then be crushed and combined with egg whites to create a glaze the colour of this perfect Australian autumn sky untouched by clouds. Learning this sort of random fact was all part of his education, she'd assured him, and although Tom wasn't convinced it would be handy for his inevitable future on a sheep station, his inquiring mind enjoyed expanding itself. Moira had plenty to share from her private school education in Adelaide and her travels in Europe. He heard the screech of a kite in the distance. It was hovering and on the hunt. The waterhole had been filled with some welcome and abundant spring rains, so the small creatures were plentiful. The creeks were running, and wildflower flowers had pushed through formerly parched wilderness. The sound of the lapping Paradise Creek wouldn't last, though. It was a transient awakening, a tease that reminded the families of pioneers why their forebears had thought this land would reward them. But that had been a false hope. It could not reward them in agriculture. It was a tough enough landscape that only the hardiest creatures like sheep could survive, and even they needed so much help. The rains had barely finished, and already the waterhole was no longer deep enough to swim in, but Tom had enjoyed a week of joy playing in it. Water was so elusive in their lives out here that they usually had to fetch and carry it from the railhead in shippers, and then be strict about its use. It would be gone, drained, evaporated, drunk away in a week or so, he guessed. But for now the waterhole had populated with all the birds he liked to spot and identify. This morning alone he'd seen cheeky, willy wagtails, honey-eaters, variegated wrens, even doves, and when the raptors had arrived, hunting for the rabbits that he tried to trap for his mother to vary their daily diet of mutton. There were always crows around, of course, making their raspy caws, ever-observant, culling crows. They were not so talkative today. Odd. He didn't want to miss the approach of the train into Fiona this morning. Its erratic arrival fueled his dreams that there were more to life than this lonely existence. The train often felt like a shiny treat in his isolated life. He looked for its billowing steam in the distance from his vantage point, and leapt down to hurtle across the desert towards the rail tracks. Racing to be near the lines before it passed was part of the fun and the challenge. It was over a mile from the waterhole, and he had to skip over cotton bush and watch out for slithering creatures, but never dropped his speed so he could arrive out of breath, but in time to wave to the driver. The blast of the air that would hit him as the train thundered past knocked all the last breath out of him. It always felt exciting. He would listen to the piercing sound of metal on metal as the rain wound its way to the siding, where a different sort of train, a line of camels, would be waiting. There the shippers would load up the camels with water, and then their Afghan handlers would take their camel train onto far-flung parts of the enormous ship station, 1 million square miles. Vern Catchlove, Tom's father, had told him with an awe sigh. Tom had been impressed. He knew how to write that number, and had been an awful lot of knots in it. He understood that the station was enormous. Tom remembered how he had looked at his mother and seen only misery at his father's words. Why was she here? Why was she married to his father, a cattle drover, gone for months at a time? He had asked her once a couple of years ago. She simply shrugged. Your father made me feel special, Tom. At a time when I needed to feel something, she said, unable to find the right words. It seemed. He wasn't who my family chose. He's who I chose. It had sounded too complex and vague a notion to press for further understanding. He had not asked again. He had been born in June on a day the mercury had reached 117 degrees Fahrenheit in the shade, his mother told him. You came quickly, Tom. The town's midwife, Mrs. Moffat, said I needed to be grateful for that, and not groan about the heat. She had tousled his hair with affection. You've always been an easy, cooperative boy, and I'm still grateful to you for it. He smiled at that fond memory and at her horror that he'd eaten goanna with a couple of the local Aboriginal families. The children were his friends, but living out here on the station he saw them rarely. Some of the Afghan children were his friends too, and he loved to see the handsome, cool Mohammed, who had moved to their region from Afghanistan. Moira had shown him on a world map where that was, and Tom had stared at all the countries around the world as she pointed. The great continents picked out in pastel colours against the pale seas. He'd squinted at Afghanistan, shaped like a sausage and nestled amongst romantic-sounding places like Tehran in Persia, Tashkent, Samarkand, Peshawar, and the Khyber Pass. Gul had been born in a city called Kabul before he travelled to Central Australia and into South Australia to bring all his experience as a Kamala to their region. Tom always thought Gul was magnificent. Sitting astride his tall charger, he wore a turban and a strong profile with his long straight nose, blue eyes, and fair complexion. His beard was black and woolly. This man of high caste in his country, and married a woman from Paris of all places, making him quite the celebrity. Tom had heard a number of new rumours about this woman, everything from her being a governess in the goldfields to a prostitute in Kalgoorlie. They were a colourful couple, but Gul was also the leader of the Afghans, who lived on what was known as Afghan Hill in a camp not far east of the main town. It wasn't often that Tom spoke to the wise men of the Afghans, but on the rare occasion he did. He had smelled chlorodyne on Gul's breath. All the Afghan men seemed to sip it from blue bottles. His mother had said it was medicine, but Tom suspected it had something else in it. He realised he'd become lost in his thoughts, and time had slipped by. The train was late today. It often was. He'd inquired with the guards about the curious timetable, and the response was, "We get here when we get here," which seemed to amuse the adults around him. For Tom Catchlove, though, the response made no sense. He liked precision. Finding order helped him to make sense of his world that felt increasingly disordered as he grew, and his father stayed away for longer periods. The need for accuracy certainly wasn't a trait of his father, who was unreliable at best. Instead, Tom's mother said he got it from her family, the Darnells. Although he had not met any of them to verify her claim, now her mind was blurry, always distracted. This lack of sharpness from the woman who had given each day of the week a specific title, from wash day to bake day, had him troubled. Now she had become as unreliable as his father, just in a different way. Tom returns from his musing, flicking at the flies and becoming aware of the new and sudden silence. Something was not right. All the birds who should have been singing and flitting about had become still. The kite had disappeared too. Did they all know something he didn't? Was he imagining their silence, or was this sense of being unnerved to do with his mother's turns? They were happening more regularly now. She was ill. The adults who came through their lives referred to it as her nerves. And at 10, he had no idea what that actually meant. But he knew it was more about his father's absence than his own presence. He didn't know how to help her, and all he could do when she was lost in that silence, staring broodiness, she slipped into what into was to take her hand and hold it in his lap. They might sit like that for hours, occasionally through a night, and then at daybreak she surfaced from the mire of whatever it was that sucked her down into its depth. She looked at him as if it recognized him again and asked him how he was, and shouldn't they be getting some food organized, or was it time to feed the horses? Tom shouldered a lot of chores and did his best to be the man around the house, as Vern had instructed him to be when he had left. He tried to remember all the smaller tasks too that his mother had was becoming forgetful over, like moistening the clay pot in which they kept their butter. In summer the pot was stored in the fireplace where it was cool. He kept the lanterns filled with kerosene, and kept a watchful eye on the slightly temperamental Coolgardie drip safe to make sure it was working, so his mother could rely on her precious food remaining cool. He helped her to grow onions and potatoes, which were their mainstay of vegetables unless they could be treated to some carrots and the like when the train came in. When it did, the kids, like Tom, knew to grab a spoon, a plate, and copper penny because they could buy a big scoop of delicious vanilla ice cream, the treat of the gods as far as Tom was concerned. His father had now been away for 8 weeks. Tom knew it was that long because he had diligently counted off the days as they turned 2 weeks on a sheet of butcher paper. As the sun slipped away each evening, his job was to light the lamps that he and his mother would eat by. He gazed at the homemade calendar that appeared gloomier for its seemingly endless row of crosses in the low flickering light. Moira did always eat, but Tom would encourage her, keeping up a one-sided conversation, making sure she could hear the gentle clatter of his fork against his plate. She insisted they eat from china crockery and observe good manners, and Tom rather liked the unexpected pleasure of elegance it lent to their meagre, lamp-lit suppers and humble surrounds. His once statuesque mother had become 5.5 feet of bones encased in fragile flesh, in stark contrast to how she looked in the two photographs they had of her life before Vern catch love. Her shoulders poked out squarely, and her elbows formed triangles wherein in motion. While he enjoyed a rare hug from her, they were fleeting, angular. He could feel the ridges of her ribs, like the washboard in laundry, when he pressed his face against her. But recently he noticed her body was changing, becoming plumper. He couldn't understand it because she ate so little, and she seemed constantly fatigued. He often heard her throwing up outside. He hadn't wanted to ask in case it meant she was ill. What if she was getting ready to blow up and explode, as he'd seen with some dead, bloated animals? But a new shape had got the better of him that night before last. "Mum, you feel softer," was the only way he could say it. She'd given him a wan smile that tried to glow out of her pale, once pretty face that was now hollowed into a ghostly version of itself. "I'll explain soon, son," she said, ruffling his hair, which had turned its traditional darker shade now that summer had passed. It sounded ominous. "Explain what? That you're dying? That I'm going to be left alone? That my father's lost? That your heartbreak or your nerves at such a thought is killing you? Is that what you meant? What about Dad?" he'd asked, knowing instinctively that she wanted to talk about him. "I'm hoping that have heard some news. It's been long enough." She began to frown, as though accounting in her mind. "He needs to be home soon," she said, her voice rising. Before what, Mum?" "Oh, nothing, just home, where we want him." Tom had nodded. He wanted his father home too. They were opposites. Where Tom was quiet, thoughtful, precise, his father was a loud, often ragged drunk, but ever cheerful person of height and stringy muscles that wrapped around his limbs. His face had etched by the sun's artistry over years of exposure, its pencil drawing deep lines as if it were a blade into the leathery skin. Vern, when home, was usually smiling or whistling some tuneless melody, and often he'd burst into song and grab Moira to twirl her around the hut. The sand of the red earth they lived upon, no matter how hard they swept, was always present and sounded gritty beneath their dance steps. Tom would slap a rhythm to his father's cheerful singing, longing for the moment when his mother would reach out and draw him into the private moment to pirouette as a trio. His father never reached for him, but that's how men were. His mother would assure Tom. He'd hug his parents around their hips, reveling in the notion of love that existed in their simple lives. His mother was no doubt longing for the bluster and laughter of Vern to echo out across the lonely landscape once again. But there was still no sign of the men on horseback and the beasts they were driving down from Queensland. He'd offered to help with extra chores, but this morning she had told him to go and play, looking paler than ever and sweaty. Horses sweat, he remembered his mother's correcting him. People perspire. She liked to educate him, insisting on teaching him over and above his school hours. So here he sat in the vulnerable Coolabah, squinting through his father's binoculars so he could focus on the township of Fiona and look for the telltale plume of steam and the screech in the far distance. But that's when it struck him how still everything had suddenly become. Up on the hill there was usually some sort of breeze, just enough to lift a few of the hairs that flopped across his hairline over his forehead, but the air wasn't stirring. The sudden cacophony that pierced the silence of the prairie was not from the rain that had hauled itself north of Adelaide 24 hours earlier, but from the birds nestling in the gums by the creek. Cockatoos rose alongside galahs, who moved quicker than the heavier cows, who were also lifting off in an instant, and collective alarm. There was a great excited discordance as the birds cried their agitation. "What the?" Tom murmured, watched the birds explode into the air like a dark cloud, and then he heard it, a groan like an ancient giant awakening. It continued, growing angrier. The rumbling came from deep in the earth and shook him. He felt the power of that shaking through every muscle and cavity of his body, until he could swear his teeth shattered. It was an earth shock. He realized something he had only heard about, and he crouched for fear of toppling, marveling at the powerful vibration, as though the cave-dwelling giant deep in the earth's core was shaking the foundation of the land on which they walked, angry at being disturbed. And then, as abruptly as it began, it stopped. The birds silenced once again, and an eerie hush laid itself back down like a picnic blanket after being flipped. He would later learn it had lasted 35 seconds, which was exactly how long it had taken his mother to realize that what she'd feared most was happening. While the land had shuddered, Moira Catchell's baby had chosen to start her journey into the world, but baby Amy had made her decision far too early. Tom could hear his mother screaming from the homestead all the way to the waterhole. The steam train was forgotten. So was the earthshock. Clutching his father's precious binoculars, Tom began to run, praying to whichever angels might hear him that they were not sending darkness his way. He harnessed up Bonnie and somehow half-carried, half-walked his mother outside and into the wagon, where he urged Moira to lie down, wrapped her in a blanket. "Mum, you have to tell me what's happening." She shook her head as if denying it, but the words finally spilled out. "You're going to have a brother or sister before the day's end, Tom." He opened his mouth with a thrill of delight. At last, someone to talk to play with, to teach about the desert life. It looked painful. "It is," she gasped, and to him it looked agonizing. "I'm going to need help." "Why are we frightened?" he asked, thinking aloud, wishing he hadn't. He wanted to be strong for her. "Because your brother or sister is arriving too early," she ground out, "and that puts them in danger, especially out here. Now stop talking and get me to town." With a grim expression, he began the bumpy journey of 18 miles to the town of Farina, propped blocks of wood behind him so he could reach the reins and control the pony properly. His mother would yell out from time to time in what seemed to be torture, and then it would subside. At first, he thought it was the rutted dirt path they were following that was upsetting her. But why was she quiet at other times on the same uneven surface? No, this was a baby. Why was his tiny brother or sister such a helpless thing, so dangerous? There was no point in asking. A glance backwards showed only a tense grimace in her expression while her hands clasped her belly. Tom gritted his teeth and encouraged Bonnie to move faster if she could without wearing herself out. Fortunately, it was a mild day. April was the month that he and his mother always craved because it began the slide into autumn. The summer's heat could reach 120 degrees. He was reminded that newborns were often laid under the shadowy cool of their mother's bed. Where had he heard that? His thoughts were like skittles, ranging off in different directions with no attachment. He was trying not to let his gaze land on the desolation of the wilderness. This was not sand like the Sahara Desert, which his mother had described to him, where the golden dunes were soft and hot, looking silken from a distance. She had explained. No, the desert was a relentless, nuggety and unforgiving gibber plain. He felt a fresh wave of panic wobble through him. What if he couldn't get her there in time? What if she dies? This was too daunting to contemplate. Tom forced his thoughts away from what scared him most towards ordered, rational memory that could deliver up a fact and distract him from the threat at hand. The earth folded in and folded on itself more than 540 million years ago. Tom had read in an encyclopedia up at the main house called Wichelina, which ran the station, and he let that fact resonate now and take over. He deliberately occupied his mind with his sort of mundane detail for a few more miles, even managing to eclipse his mother's intermittent yells by thinking about the morning's earth shock, which was related to the plate tectonics he learned about. He reminded himself to try and record 540 million as a number. Come on, Bonnie, not much further now, he lied, because he had no idea how close or how far they were. He lost track, and so it was with surprise and trembling relief that he spotted the outskirts of the town and its activity. He could see people like ants moving around, and across the distance left to cover, he could make out the iron sounds of a forge, while the odd voice pierced the distance in a shout or burst of laughter. He glanced over his shoulder where his mother lay, deaf still. "Mum, Mum," she groaned in answer. "We're here. We'll be in Fiona minutes at the hospital." All she did was nod. Her eyes remained closed. Hospital was a loose term even in the mind of a 10-year-old. The rather grandly titled Transcontinental Hotel had been converted into a hospice of sorts and depended on bush nursing and a series of travelling doctors who arrived by train from Corn. Tom knew from the adult conversations he had overheard that finding a permanent doctor had proved impossible, and it was hard enough to get nurses to stay. He'd heard one of the townsfolk admit that any serious injury likely meant death. Out of need, most of the locals knew how to set and mend bones themselves, his mother included. He began yelling from the fringe of the town, drowning his mother's cries and attracting a host of people who soon pushed him out of the way. Within minutes he was watching the person he loved more than any other be carried away from him towards the long stone building with its cheerful striped tin veranda. Two women in starched nurse outfit were taking control of proceedings. In the activity, Tom was barely noticed, but he was used to that, and he remembered his father's rules: horse first. His mother was now in the best hands, the only hands that could help her. He led Bonnie slowly back down to the stables behind the Exchange Hotel before unharnessing her from the wagons, tying her up and seeing to her care. The voice of men drifting through to the stable from the Bushy Hotel. Someone was playing a mouth organ on its veranda, which lent a melancholy note to an otherwise raucous-sounding gathering of workers after a long day. The evening was closing in, and the smell of old beer wafted through to where Tom was stroking Bonnie's neck. "There's fresh water and food. I don't know how long we'll be here, but I'll be back soon, all right?" Bonnie snorted and bent her head to her pail of hay that he already paid the stable master for. Luckily, he'd had the foresight to bring his mother's purse. He tucked the tiny leather sack back beneath his shirt on the thong she wore around her neck for safekeeping. He tapped Bonnie's rump affectionately. Moving into the darkness, away from the lights, laughter, and even the mournful music, he rounded the back of the hotel to go in search of his mother. The strains of the sad melody was cut short by a loud voice. "Hey, knackers, play something decent, will you, mate? Making us all cry in here." As Tom picked up the pace, headed back into town, he could hear the tune of the Jolly Lumberjack that his father sometimes played. It made him smile, but Tom's smile was short-lived. Thanks.